Hello, everyone, and welcome to our horse talk. Today we are here with Dr. Ross MacPhee from the American Museum of Natural History. He has asked that we just refer to him as Ross. We do have everyone muted just for respect for our speakers. If you do have questions, please put them in the notes and we will answer them as we can. We're very excited that we have this horse talk in light of Theodore Roosevelt National Park putting out their draft environmental assessment this week. That looks pretty dismal for the horses in the park. So we're hoping that Ross can help answer some of those questions too and give us some insight. So I thought maybe it would help if Ross just kind of talk a little bit about himself and maybe things he's working on right now before we get started.
Certainly. Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. All right. I'm a recently retired curator at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, where I was curator of mammals. I was there for the better part of 30 years. So whatever that means, I'm here now in front of you, and that's the audience that I want. I got interested in horses as living creatures. I'm a paleontologist, so I do a lot of work with dead things, but horses as a living species, I got interested in just over 10 years ago at, of all things, a symposium at the New York University Law School. They were taking a look at management practices and not just the legal aspects. In fact, legal aspects, I think, were really a minor part of it. There were a number of speakers, some who were very pro how BLM manages wild horses. Others, like myself, were not. And it was engaging because I had, prior to that, really no idea what the dimension of the problem was, how horses were being treated, what the methodologies were. It was just appalling to me that you could round up intelligent cursorial mammals like horses by helicopter and by other means, shop them off to management areas, or taking them out of management areas rather, and shopping them out to who would ever offer to buy them. And somehow that would solve the problem. Well, of course it doesn't. So I got interested further just on the professional side, because it also made no sense to me that horses, Equus caballus is the proper species name, were so different in the Pleistocene just a few tens of thousands of years ago than the horses we have today. And I stated that position in a number of gray literature places, because I did not conceive of myself as a horse expert at that time. And I got a certain amount of response. The people were saying, yes, we don't understand either. What do you think's going on? What can you do about it? Well, I did not do very much about it, except talk to people sort of one-on-one, until about 5 years ago, when Amanda Kalimian, who's the chairperson of the CHWHA Foundation, approached me and said, can you help us from a scientific point of view? And I said, well, I don't know. I don't have the skills that would be really helpful here to show that living horses and Pleistocene horses are the same thing, the same species. We would need geneticists for that, and people particularly who were competent in ancient DNA, because one of the things one would have to show is that the horses that used to live in North America until a few thousand years ago were in fact the same stock, the same thing, the same species as living Equus caballus. So in light of that, we worked with Beth Shapiro and her lab in California at Santa Cruz. She's a leading expert in ancient DNA, and one of her postdocs took on the problem of trying to show relationships, genetic relationships in this case, between horses living in Siberia 40,000 years ago or so, and horses that lived in America at roughly the same time, up till their extinction point. And what was very interesting, again, because it was not something that people had done before, we were able to show that the genetic results indicated that populations living in Siberia multiply crossed over to North America, and the same thing happened on the North American side. In other words, Beringia, the land bridge between America and Eurasia, was not a one-way street. The animals kept in contact. And if you've ever looked at a map of Beringia, you can see why. It's bigger than Texas when it was above sea level, of course, and just an extension of the environments that existed on both sides, both in Alaska and in Chukotka. So that was a start. It indicated that there had been what we technically call hybridization between populations. You can have hybridization at many different levels, including the technical level of species or anything under them, which means usually groups of populations. And we were hoping that the hybridization factor continued long enough so that we could make an argument that even though horses died out here, that they had sent over emissaries on repeated times in the past to Eurasia, and it's from that stock that modern horses developed. Now, that is still the case. There is no question about that. Equus cabalis's immediate antecedents arose in North America, across the land bridge, now we know several times, and it's from that stock, as it were, that domestication first took place in Central Asia about 6,000 years ago. So that was a start, and it allowed me to continue to make the one species argument, as we like to call it. Then the next big thing was with another colleague, Hendrik Poinar, at Hamilton University or rather McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada. Another ancient DNA expert, but he had a great graduate student who at that time was doing what's called environmental DNA. Now, very simply, it's this. Animals are always shedding cells, whether it's from your skin or from excrement or wounds or what have you. There's ubiquity. There's cell material everywhere around us, which may sound a little bit yuck, but you can't see them mostly. And the point is that scientists can nowadays, thanks to modern methods, in many cases, literally grab teaspoons full of dirt, run them through a sequencer, and get results. Now, what are the results? Well, the DNA is very degraded. It's not attached to fossils in any obvious sense. It's just in the dirt, probably attached to quartz crystals and things like that. And what it represents is kind of the leftover from the process of disintegration after death or after loss of the cells. So you only have very short sequences, the base pairs that we use as the building blocks for understanding DNA. But if those blocks are long enough and discrete enough, distinctive enough, you can actually identify species, as astounding as that sounds. From just a few dozen base pairs, 50 base pairs, you can not do anything else, frankly, but you can identify, probabilistically at least, the species you're dealing with. And why that ended up interesting was because the work was being done in Yukon in northern Canada from cores drilled down into the permafrost. You extract a big tube worth of sediments, frozen sediments, and scientists use that kind of material for all kinds of purposes. And what Hendrik and his team did was extract DNA. What they found was not only an incredible record of species of all sorts that lived in Yukon between 40,000 and about 5,000 years ago. Plants, animals, microbes, you name it. The DNA or the RNA was there, exploitable, a basis for making identifications, a basis for actually reconstructing ecosystems. I mean, can you imagine if you can get most of the plant life that was around at one time, you can model it and make sense of what the landscapes looked like and the animals that were feeding there and things of that sort. Incredible work. And to bring it back to horses now, the astounding thing was that they continued to get a signal after 10,000 BP, before present. 10,000 is the semi-arbitrary date for stating when the extinctions of large mammals at the end of the Pleistocene occurred in North America. And what Taylor Murchie and Hendrick found was that instead they were continuing to get signals up until about 6,000 years ago. Now, that may sound like a long period of time. It is. It's not immediately proximate to the present. That would have been astounding if they'd been able to do that. It's just that the top of the core was reached. That's it. The last 6,000 years were missing, so there was nothing more to be done. They have continued to do that work, but of course they have their own interests that they're prosecuting, and just worrying about whether or not one species lived up until, say, 500 years ago is not something that they're committing a lot of resources to. But other people are interested, and my expectation and hope is that cores or core-like environments will be utilizable at some point by some lab, and we'll get a picture of the persistence, perhaps, of horses up until relatively recent times. Okay, so all of that's the good news. Chris, I'm going to give only one more example, and then we'll go back to questions, I think. The other thing, and this was kind of a blow to the argument, Orlando and his group at the University of Toulouse in France, a very well-known team that does horse ancient and modern DNA analyses of all sorts, did a study, which I'm sure a lot of the audience has heard about. It was published in Science, very important magazine or journal in science. And what they found, I should say what they concentrated on. What were they interested in? Because they weren't interested in the species problem as I outlined it. What they were interested in was how many bloodlines, when those bloodlines came in, how did they interact, when did indigenous people first get horses, because that's a controversial subject, and so on and so forth. So the way I like to look at it is they were looking inside modern domestic horses, trying to determine relationships, geographical areas where horses came from over the last 500 years or so. But as one part of that study, it was inevitable that they also looked at Pleistocene horses, and they looked at DNA in a comparative kind of manner to see whether or not there was any basis for thinking that some amount of modern horse inheritance still bears that earmark, still bears a sign that horses might have survived up until very recent times. And when the Europeans came over and horses started escaping, living wild, and perhaps mating accordingly with any horses that were left over from the Pleistocene, then they would be able to show that. Well, no. There was less than 1% of the genome that they were looking at, which could be ascribed to ancient horses in that kind of manner. And that could strictly be just from inheritance way back, well before even the differentiation of Equus caballus as a species. So where we are now is that we don't have a candidate argument for horses surviving right up to the appearance of Europeans. We don't have a way forward of doing anything else genomically, because, as I said, this was a very comprehensive study, and there's not many loopholes to look at. What we can continue to do, which is still relevant to the whole issue, I think, is to see how long horses might have lasted somewhere in North America. The only evidence of late survival that we've got so far that is really solid is from northern Yukon. Well, that's quite a distance from here, obviously. And this is the place where we're having the problems with how horses are being managed. It's not the same thing in Canada. And what the Canada Foundation is doing now is undertaking a comprehensive radiocarbon program of horse fossils that have already been found, already described in the literature, all of that kind of thing, that were at one point suggested to be from within the last 10,000 years. In other words, post the Pleistocene or the megafaunal extinctions. Now, what will that mean? Well, if we can get horses that are 4,000 or 3,000 or whatever, that brings their extinction date up closer to the present. And one of the things that we want to strenuously argue for is that if horses were present in what are otherwise modern ecosystems, then it is simply false to argue that Pleistocene horses, who share almost all of their genomes with horses that are living today, why they should be excluded from the native species list. Let me repeat that in a slightly less complicated way. Although I said that the Orlando study said that there was no evidence of hybridization between the last Pleistocene horses and the ones that are with us today, please understand from that otherwise their genomes are 99.9% the same. They are the same thing. Now, from my point of view, they should be considered the same species, but if they were the same species, then you'd expect to see hybridization as a result of their having survived long enough to interbreed with the newcomers. And that we don't have, and looks like we won't get it. So whatever this all amounts to, it looks like horses did in fact die out on this continent. But I continue to make the argument that it is really some kind of false precision to say that the horses that used to live here, none of them belong in Equus caballus as such, defined as a species, I mean. And that's where we are. We're going to do this program. We're going to try and get a good assembly of dates. If any of them look any good, meaning that they're young, then we'll see if there's any DNA. And if they've got DNA, then I don't know. I've been disappointed before. Let's hope that somehow or other we can find some evidence for continuing to make a stronger argument for horses being all in the same species. Okay, I'm done.
Well, thank you. That's all very fascinating. And I look forward to the research that you're doing. So then a question that I have, because this came up with what you were saying, in 2018, the park released a genetic study on the horses here in the park, and they did find links to the horses in the park on the Siberian Peninsula. So that's not shocking based on the things that you were saying in your introduction.
Yeah, that's very probably exactly what we're talking about. There is, in terms of the genes they were looking at, this trace element, as it were, derived from much earlier days. And although I know what you're referring to, they specifically said Siberian, but that shared material is going to be everywhere in Eurasia. That if you go back far enough, horse fossils are going to display that, just like the ones in North America. Unfortunately, it's not diagnostic, and that's the issue.
Okay. One of the reasons why originally I wanted to talk to you is we talked a little bit at the Save Our Wild Horses conference, and we were talking about the Nakota horses. But we were talking about them in relation to the horses that are in the park now.
Yeah.
And part of what we were talking about was, it seems now that over the last 3 years, where they've kind of left the herd alone because of COVID and other outside forces that have stopped them from just constant culling of the horses, it seems to me like we're starting to see some of those Nakota traits coming back. And you said something that's been like echoing in my head for a long time since our conversation, is something to the effect of, like, just because people decided those horses aren't Nakota horses doesn't mean that those genes don't still exist. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, not every gene has a phenotypic expression. And by that, I mean that you can see something that's connected to that gene on the physiognomy, in this case of the horse. A lot of genes just don't show up. I mean, there's no expression of them on the surface, so you'd never know. Now, in talking about Lakota features, formational features, what I've heard is that they have personalities that are really quite different from most other horses. I'm in no position to judge that kind of thing. But what worries me is the following, that you can get convergence. And by that, I mean, especially within groups of the sort that we're talking about, where although the animals might not be very closely related, for one reason or another, they, during their phylogenetic or evolutionary history, have had certain mutations in basically the same gene. not present in their ancestor. The mutation was not down there, but came along later. So they end up, for whatever we're talking about, looking roughly the same. That is not evidence of really close relationship. That's the problem.
Okay.
What we want nowadays is multi-factor, multi-gene panels that we're looking at. So statistically, if things are related, then it's going to show up in a statistical sense in the results. It's much the same when we're talking about consanguinity in humans, right? You might share hair color with somebody, maybe nose type or something like that, and you say, "Oh, you must be Janet's progeny or something
Right.
of that sort." But then you do the DNA testing, and it turns out that there's nothing more to it. There's just a similarity that is not connected with the evolution or the with the evolution of who you're looking at. I have the feeling that Lakota horses are distinctive in the minds of the viewers because they know what they're looking at and looking for. I'm not denying anything about the meaning of that and the significance of that. I'm just saying that for an outside observer who's particularly looking at something in a genomic kind of way, there isn't enough to go on to
Okay.
make any other kind of statement.
Okay. Another question I have for you, and this has come up this week with the environmental assessment being released. The parks, part of their argument is they're trying to return to a natural prairie ecosystem, but they aren't defining that. So how would you define that? Or can you give some insight to what you think?
Yeah, you sent me their livestock plan, or at least a link to it. So I took a look at that, and I was amazed at in two things. First of all, how thorough it was, and at the same time, how weaselly it was about topics that are of interest to this group right now. There are lots of statements about who's native and non-native,
right.
sort of strict borders all around. And with regard to horses and with regard to the environment, what I really didn't like, and you just see it again and again, is that if there's damage done, it's always the horse's fault, that they're always trampling this and that, and eroding riparian landscapes, and so on and so on. And it's just such a silly argument, because in real life, if we were talking about a truly wild horse, never domesticated, living along with other wild animals, they interact all the time. It's unavoidable. And
Right.
it's not just predator prey. And the idea that horses are particularly bad news for sage grouse and so on, it's just an absurdity on its face. You can tell that that was not written by an evolutionary biologist. It was written by a range manager type. And I'm not denigrating anything about their area of competence, but this isn't one of them. Let me go back to landscapes for a moment, because to me, this is the critical point. What is not well understood is that the grasslands that used to exist in this country, that the similar kinds of biomes or environments that used to exist in Eurasia, those were created and maintained by mega mammals. How did they do that? Obviously, they didn't go around planting seeds themselves. No, they just did the things that you would expect, eating hundreds of pounds every day of
Right.
local fodder. In the case of a horse, since they're hindgut fermenters, things were not so thoroughly digested as they are in the case of a cow. You'd get viable seeds being spread out all over the place. Seeds of many different kinds of plants, because they're not necessarily choosy eaters. And if you have enough animals of large size doing that, then you can create basically the mammoth steppe, as paleontologists call it. This was, at the time, the largest environment or biome of its type that stretched all the way from the British Isles across the length of Asia into at least Alaska and probably into Yukon and maybe further. And what it was an extremely rich, extremely diverse grassland. And the animals, because they were processing the plants and all of their nutrients were staying in the soil, staying on the land, along with their carcasses, that over time you had not a hyper fertilized, but a very well fertilized grassland. Now, what's happened to that? Well, in this country, what's happened to that is agriculture. Agriculture is all about single crops, suppression of everything else that might be weedy or something you don't want. And what happens in consequence is that the soils lose a lot because there's only one species of, say, wheat, barley, whatever, that's growing in those circumstances. And you also lose the microbiome that was associated with that particular soil. All of which is very important because grasslands that have been degraded by agriculture in particular, but by other means as well, they take a very long time to respond because it's like they had a wasting disease and there's not much left of them anymore. So it takes a long time to return to some kind of optimal situation.
So can I
So
ask
where we are,
you,
yeah,
the park as a fenced area that's not, that hasn't had agriculture in there, we're told a lot in a lot of different forage reports and studies that have been done, the soil there is very nutrient rich. So I don't know if that makes a difference too. I understand what you're saying about how we've invaded the landscape here, but the soils within the park, studies that have been done show that very nutrient rich soil that the mammals are flourishing on.
well, precisely because it's a diverse landscape. So there's a lot of niche opportunity. Where I was going with this, Chris, I guess I'm being
Sorry.
too voluminous in my comments, was that they are under the impression that the grassland part, the part that had allocations or whatever on them, are degraded because of the horses.
Right.
And what they should be thinking about instead was exactly what you pointed out, that there are places still that are nutrient rich, that haven't been overcropped, we're never in agriculture, all of that, and should think in terms of how do we restore that? How do we make the rest of the park that good? And you make it that good by bringing in the mega herbivores again, which in this case would be horses, but it would also be bison. That's what we have left. The other biggie back in the Pleistocene was mammoth. We don't want to bring mammoths back. Believe me, we don't want that. But we do want grasslands that are diverse as they can be in order to support every other aspect of grassland adopted biotas. What do I mean by that? I mean all the invertebrates. I mean the things that you never see that actually do a lot of the hard jobs in terms of returning nutrients to the soil through degradation and that kind of thing. That's what's lacking. And that's why grasslands that are now out of agricultural production don't look very good, even if they're not being cropped by cattle. It's just because there's so much that's been lost. So the point I want to make, and this is a point I do strongly want to make, the future for all of these places is rewilding. Very simply, the idea that you're not trying to restore something to back how it was in the Pleistocene, that's out of the question. What you're trying to do is to make it the best possible landscape with the largest number of creatures and plants that belong there to thrive. And that on that basis, you're doing everybody a benefit. Carbon sequestration being one of them, for example. So what I didn't like in reading that report was the idea that somehow horses outcompete everybody. I mean, come on. Let's talk seriously. Not every herbivore eats exactly the same one or two plants. It's a very opportunistic kind of dietary regime. You eat what you can, where you can, how you can. It may well be that horses now and again don't allow the pronghorns in. I don't know. There was an example of some sort like that. After which they immediately
they push the bison and elk away from waterways, which
and in that particular passage, the next sentence began with the word conversely, because another researcher had found no exclusionary thing like this. But then they had to make an editorial comment was, well, the samples weren't very good, this, that, the next thing. So we really don't know. Damn right, you just don't want to face up to the fact that there's some kind of extraordinary pressure to get all of the livestock out, which is a different question. And we can get to that if you want, but it's a different question from the one that I'm interested in, which is restoration of grasslands and
Right.
doing it naturally, which means mega herbivores being in there who should have pride of place. They're the ones that should be encouraged to be there because of the job that they do.
And I think that if I'm correct, at the Save Our Wild Horses conference, you were talking about a balanced ecosystem does have bison, horses,
Yeah.
deer, elk, because that's when I started talking. I was like, we have that. We have that in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. So what is it they're trying to restore? Because it seems like they have an optimal area and an optimal situation, especially what you're talking about as far as rewilding and, bison and horses living together. I witnessed with my husband during the winter months, bison herd. We were watching to try to figure out why they were pushing horses, like they kept moving the horses, pushing the horses out of the
Mhm.
area. They were doing it because where the horses were standing, and as they moved the snow away from the ground, and the bison, it was easier for them to get to the grass underneath. It was amazing to me. It was like nature working in harmony. You know what I mean? The horses were doing the work, of course, but it was interesting to watch. So what they're saying about, the horses not allowing the bison um to go to water and things like that, like we've seen the exact opposite within the park boundaries, but it does seem like they've got an opportunity for a very good ecosystem that's already there and thriving.
Right, which means all this maneuvering is just inexplicable, except politically. It has everything to do with that, and really very little to do with the scientific question. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all in favor of native species living in native circumstances. That's very important. It's also important, however, to realize that thanks to our poor husbandry in many areas, that there's large parts of the planet, let alone just the US, that are in dire need of rewilding, mixtures of species whose behavior, whose diets, and so on are strictly useful for restoration purposes. And one of the things that I've also pushed for is why not have mixed herds of horses and cattle, which I know is anathema to a lot of horse advocates, but that's again for historical reasons. The bison is an extremely close relative of cow, so why are you excluding the one but you're fine with the other? Well, there's reasons. I understand that, and especially politically and economically. What you want is horses to be able to live in circumstances that benefit them as near native species, if I can put it that way, on our landscapes. And just all of the other arguments having to do with their historical importance in opening up this country, being the animated machinery
Right.
until other kinds of devices came along. They were everything. And now they don't have an economic role, so they're done. This
Right.
is a bad thing. Attitudinally, it's a very bad thing.
Um, so I think then that brings up the question of it, what is native? Like how is that defined? And
Yeah.
you know, so like part of our argument is that these horses were fenced into this park. The park didn't even realize they were there for a while. You had to reintroduce bison and elk, which is great, right? We're not against the bison, we're not against the elk, but where's the sense of native then? Or as our attorney general had said, they may not have been here, like you said, maybe we can only go back 6,000 years and find horses in North America, but there isn't anybody currently living in North Dakota that remembers a time when these horses weren't in the park. So can you talk a little bit about that native, non-native, and where that sits with their argument here?
Yes, it's It's a tough one because native as a noun means different things to different people. When I use it, I'm talking about it from a scientific point of view. A native species is something that evolved in situ, that it lived here, that it developed here. And of course, you end up very quickly in gray areas because what happens when you've got a long history of a species that's dispersed from one area to another, is able to make a living, doesn't push anybody else out, blah, blah. Why aren't they sort of grandfathered in after a point? Well, they probably are, in the sense that people just ultimately accept them as parts of the natural landscape. I'm going to do a slight diversion here because one of my areas of specialty is biogeography, which is where species are in space and time. Any area on the planet, and let's just talk terrestrial for a minute, has had influxes of species from elsewhere since day one. The ones that survive and carry on and find a place, a niche, and have survived up to the present, we consider them native. But to begin with, they were invasive species. This is another one of these stark contrasts. So there's invasive or alien species, and then there's the good guys. It's a false dichotomy, once again. If everybody's invasive to a greater or lesser extent, then what are you basing your distinction on? You can't run the tape all the way back to 1,000,000 BC and have a dividing line like that. It just makes no sense. Where I am with horses is that since, again, this is not open to debate, there's nobody in my professional body who would think otherwise. Horses, namely Cabeline horses, Equus caballus, evolved on this continent. There's just no question about that. It had the misfortune to die out, all right. But as I've said in other contexts like this, does that mean they lose their citizenship because they weren't around for a while? They were elsewhere but want to come back? To me, that's a distinction without a difference, that horses, by virtue of everything they were, not only to the landscapes of North America at the time, but also to us until the last century, means that they should have a place. And that having that place is so important, not only to them, but to other things that live there and live out their lives and evolved there. It's all kind of a huge set of ecological relationships and interactions, like the one you were just pointing to, Chris. How did the bison ever learn that you have to get the horse out of the way in a way that he kicks out the stone so that you can come in and feed? I mean, that's a great story because it underlines so many of these interactions that humans never see. They're oblivious to this kind of thing, that species have lots of communication and sort of interpersonal relationships that go unnoticed, but benefit one or both of the interactors. And that's really the point. Another thing I noticed in that livestock report was that, the horses are so bad because the way they crop it and so on leads to wildfires, or there's something of that nature. Fire was mentioned. And here's my point. They're grazers. If you want to reduce the amount of grass because you think that's tinder in a particular place, bring in some horses, bring in some cows, fine, but do something that naturally will result in a smaller grass crop. And you'd be amazed at how you don't get the ignition temperatures like we've seen on this continent, especially in the past 2 years, where the fires get explosively hot very quickly, and really nothing can stop them.
Right.
They run out of tinder, or the rains come, or something of that nature. That's going to be a continuing problem. And we all know Bill Simpson and his fire brigade. This is a beneficial argument. It cannot be practiced in most places, but certainly it could be practiced in a place like Teddy Roosevelt or other parks of that nature, where it's very important for people who go there, who want to enjoy being in natural circumstances, that they don't get chased out by fire every year.
Right.
and the investment would be negligible.
Well, so then that brings me a couple different questions. One is, um, something that we don't think about, and this came out in our comment period and research that I was doing for our comments. We don't always think about the park itself as an ecosystem and what that park does to maintain the wildlife and the landscape that we see when we go through the park every day. So what would that impact be on the park itself as an ecosystem for removing 200 horses quickly out of there from an ecological standpoint?
Well, that leaves your grazers as elk, mule deer, pronghorn, none of which are going to ever be in large numbers, I imagine. So that means that the graze that those animals go after will be proportionately less than what you would have if horses and cattle, for that matter, were on the landscape. Where that goes, I don't know, beyond increasing the fire hazard. I think that's a fair comment. What else would it interfere with? Hard to say without doing the studies. That's always the problem. So much of this is anecdotal. I've seen this, you've seen that, and that's not a way to proceed. More importantly, perhaps from just the vitality of the park itself, apparently people like to see horses.
Right.
Again, I was flabbergasted by this livestock report that, well, we don't keep any figures, but 49% of the people that we had formerly polled said they like to see horses. Well, okay, you want to get rid of them?
There was
Why don't you
1,400
first?
people, 49% of 1,400 people
Yeah.
that they polled,
So,
right?
you want to get rid of them? Why don't you think twice about this and actually do a survey and see how many people would like to see horses, period, would like to see horses doing what you were talking about with the bison, or the horses interacting with each other,
Right.
running across landscapes. All of these things that people seem to really enjoy are going to be removed. And what do you have? You have other charismatic mammals, but many of them prefer to be cryptic. They're not sort of out there like horses are, and are not necessarily herders. So all you're doing is reducing the potential enjoyment of the park, it seems to me. That would be the big deal.
They also talk a lot in here about the effects of climate change, and of course the negative impacts the horses have on the environment, and they use that as a reason. So I don't know if you can speak to that. And there's also even a line in here about how the horses negatively impact air quality and things like that.
I didn't come across the air quality one, but I was amused that in their so-called foundational document, they're making this sound like the U.S. Constitution. Wow.
Right.
That they want the atmosphere, as it were, when Teddy was around. So they want the native animals, they want the buildings, they want this and that. They also want the sounds and the smells. All right. So what could be more natural than a field of horses and their manure to give you a sense of what that's like? It's about as natural as it comes.
Right.
And the idea that you want to sanitize everything down to a nubbin, right? There's such controlled experiences. I think this is awful. That kind of approach is just so silly. Now,
Um, go ahead.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I don't recollect the first part of your question, so please give it to me.
The global warming aspect, because they
Global
talk.
warming. Okay, so well, I mean, again, it's such a fatuous argument. Do you really think that horses are contributing anything to global warming just by virtue of being alive and living there in the park? You've got cattle releasing methane. Horses don't do that. You've got just globally fossil fuels being burnt everywhere, contributing massively to the real problem, and are the real contributors more than any other single thing. So global warming, it's just another red herring, throwing it out there because you want to see whether it can stick. And since you loathe horses, or they do for whatever reason, then why not just give another negative and see how that wears? I think a lot of it can be challenged just on the basis that it's so anecdotal, first of all, but also on the basis that if their job is, and I believe this is in their job description, they're meant to keep these natural areas in a state that they can be enjoyed by the public.
Right.
That's the point. Recreation value. And if horses meet the test, then what are you doing by subtracting them from the overall list of enjoyable features of the Teddy Roosevelt Park? It
Very
just
well.
doesn't make sense. That's the basic problem I have. So I can only think that, as usual, these agendas are being secretly driven by political circumstances. It's not that perhaps anybody really cares whether there's a couple of hundred horses there. It's that they can satisfy some group that they've done what's necessary. And I don't like that. And I think it's great that you folks are fighting it.
It seems like this has been, like if you go through Dr. Castle McLaughlin's report, this has just been the standard for the park since they realized the horses were fenced in. They've just been trying to get rid of them. And every 10 or 20 years, people have said too, they go through these, big campaigns to try to eliminate the horses. And
Yeah.
they've even said in their 1978 document, it's almost like a warning for the future park staff. We don't ever recommend totally eliminating from the horses from the park because public outcry and local pressure is too great. And here they came, really with a lot of teeth in it, trying to get rid of the horses from the park. So, like the last 2 pages in the document are very telling, where they let us know, over 19,000 people commented. We know they overwhelmingly commented that they wanted the horses in the park. And the last 2 pages go through letting you know pretty much they're not keeping any horses in any capacity. It doesn't matter if it's reproductive, not reproductive, cultural, historical, any of that. We're not keeping them, but we're also engaged in an objective NEPA process. So, I mean, kind of really a lot of double-edged swords throughout this whole document, like you've pointed out. So, there are, I know, like when you talk about rewilding, and I think the bison ended up getting a bad rap in this because they actually listed the Bison Initiative by the Secretary of the Interior as one of their purpose statements now for this. So, they have to restore, and that goes along with, I guess, restoring this natural prairie ecosystem that they haven't defined for us either. But can you talk about the relationship between horses and bison and the way that they graze, and in a rewilding sense, and how that is working? And I mean, it obviously is working here. We've talked about that, but how it does work in restoring ecosystems.
Well, again, I can't be an authority on this because I just don't know enough. What we see in the fossil record, which I think is applicable to a certain extent, is that there was a time in North America and also in Siberia when the mammoth steppe was around, when you must have had, I hope this is not an exaggeration, but probably billions of these large herbivores, because there was nothing really that could predate upon them. Saber-toothed cats would go after the cows and things like that, but they're not going to mess with bulls, especially ones that are defending females. And so it is that's a truism with mega herbivores everywhere, that by and large they have very few, if any, natural predators, and they do what they like. Now, what I suspect with regard to bison versus horse is that in a typical landscape with some kind of relief, the horses are going to be able to go after resources that the cattle can't, or the bison can't, just because of body form. Bison are not built to climb up foothills, climb up steep banks and things that horses can negotiate. And if you have a rich grassland, then there's plants for everyone.
Right.
There's food for everyone, and they're not going to be in any meaningful competition. When it's restricted, when there isn't much, when it's overgrazed, then of course, I suspect because that's an unusual and bad situation, everybody's going to suffer. But it's not inherent in the system. What's inherent in the system, if you could exclude humans and their works, then all of these grasslands would still be functioning in probably the same way that they did back in the Pleistocene, maybe with somewhat fewer species, but the principle would be the same. We're not there now over, I would say, almost all of the country for one reason or another, whether it's just agriculture or urbanization or roads cutting into everything so that animals can't get around and so on and so forth. I think that rewilding is not a panacea as well. I want to make that point. It has to be managed. It's not conservation in the
And that's what I was going to
tradition.
say. I think that it all comes down to proper management of this park,
Yes,
of not just the horses, all the animals in there. Because
yes.
removing 200 horses to add another 200 bison, what does that change?
Uh, More methane being emitted in the park.
Right.
That's what changes, and that's about it. Yes, it's just amazingly short-sighted. I think that the Park Service does not see how much they could do. They've got the raw material to present to the public a very different picture than the public probably thinks horses and bison and other large herbivores what they do. They're just seen as, I guess, sort of bystanders, right? They're there, and it's nice to see them, and I hope that you enjoy your grass, but that's it. There's no more comprehensive understanding. And what I think is that if people are going to Teddy Roosevelt in order to enjoy nature, then it is almost natural that you get them to go that extra step and start thinking about what they're seeing. Why are things organized in this way in a natural habitat? Who's doing what? What are the kinds of webs of interactions that exist, and what can I see? And if I see something, will I be able to explain it to somebody else and feel very, very good about myself because I understood a natural history lesson? That's what's going to missing. That's what's going to go missing, I think. It's a pity.
But I do think, like I was just saying, it does come down to just proper management, not just the management that we're fighting for
Yeah.
the horses, but the management of the park in general, so that people can experience all of those things.
Yes.
Um, I don't know if I have anything else. I think I know we've kept you for about an hour, so I appreciate it. Um, I don't know if you have anything else to add or anything else to add about the environmental assessment. I truly, truly appreciate this talk. This was very fascinating.
Well, I'd like to learn from you. In fact, what are the next steps? So you have a commentary period, and then what?
So the next step is the public comment period goes until October 25th. Senator Hoeven is trying to get that extended. Right now, they were having a civic engagement meeting that was scheduled for Tuesday, and we brought to their attention that the Medora City Council was also meeting that day and time. So, the mayor, the city council, many businesses wouldn't be able to be a part of that, and they refused to meet the public in person, which I think is very criminal in itself. Especially when you're making remarks like you are about how there's no economic impact if they remove the horses. The businesses in the town deserve to talk
Oh,
to the park face to face about that, and they just outwardly refuse. They refuse to talk to the media. I was at a news station this morning. The media, they won't talk to the media. They won't answer their questions. They direct them to their wild horse portal. They told them, go to the civic engagement meeting. So so it's really sad that they're not engaging with the community like they're doing the bare minimum that they have to. So we're fighting. I mean, we're going to fight. We've been explaining the EA as best we can to our followers, kind of picking it apart, letting people know, what we're seeing that they may not be seeing, or just explaining, even those last 2 pages, like I said, are very telling. I mean, we're not keeping horses in any capacity. We have a law firm that we're working with. So like we said, when we have to go through this NEPA process, they'll come back with their final EA and then the finding of no significant impact. And if things stay the same, and if our law firm lets us know that there is reason to litigate, then we of course will, take this as far as we can. We're just right now raising awareness, trying to get as many people as we can to comment, and just continuing to fight, because once these horses are gone, um, we're not going, they're not going to be brought back. And what I find is really ironic is they talk so much about the bison initiative and how the bison were, on the brink of extinction and everything else. And so we have to repair that habitat. Don't you think that we learn ever from our past? And what happens when we get to the horse initiative? Who knows when from here, because we've destroyed all of that everywhere. So that's extremely sad. I do have somebody that had a question. I don't know if I don't see your question, Beth. If you want to type it in again, I don't see any question from you. So somebody did have a question, but let's see. Because horses died out in North America, too many people argue that they're feral and invasive. Is there a book that explains that? Is there something that we can look at that would explain that?
What is the difference between feral and anything else?
Um, because the horses died out in North America, she says too many people argue that the horses are feral. I don't know if you want to talk about that, because that's also it's a very
Okay. Well,
point.
yeah, I can talk about it in the following sense, and it goes back to another Orlando study, which was the roots of domestication. What he was interested in doing in this particular case was to see whether there was any argument for truly wild horses, tarpon, which I assume is a name that everybody here would understand as being a Pleistocene horse, particularly European, to see whether there were any populations left that could be considered different from Equus caballus enough to think that they'd had a different evolutionary history. The one that always comes up is Przewalski's horse as being a different species on this and that basis. And what Orlando showed was that every horse living today comes from a feral background, which means that their distant ancestors were in some form of domestication 5, 6, maybe even more thousand years ago. And if there were surviving wild horses in the true sense, then they died out without contributing, except for that fraction of 1% that I was talking about earlier. It would be the same thing on the Eurasian context as it would be here. And he showed, I think exhaustively, that everything that we have today is Equus caballus, and they all come from a root ancestry that was domesticated. And there's really not much more to be said. I was surprised that Przewalski did not end up being considered a separate species, but it isn't on genomic basis, which is far more precise and exhaustive in terms of what they look at than morphologists do. So that's where we are. Apart from technical papers, Beth, I don't think there is anything, I'm sorry, that I'm aware of, which would take it up more than what I've just said. But if you Google on Orlando and horse, then those earlier studies will come up, and you can have a look and see what you think.
So do you think that so scientifically feral is the correct term for wild horses, because they've all,
Yes.
and I think that where the argument comes from wild horse advocates is, for example, the wild horses in Theodore Roosevelt National Park didn't come from any ranch. They were all born in the park. So, and I think it goes back again to the native question then, and how far back do you?
Right, and you can also see another point, I think, which is the leakiness of these categories, because how long do you have to be removed from your domestication ancestry before you could be considered wild again?
Right.
It's not like it's a stamp that goes on the forehead, right? I'm feral forever. It just doesn't work that way. What you're talking about is human manipulation of breeding patterns so that they get the results they want. And the results that they wanted, presumably 6,000 years ago, was to reduce aggression, to have more malleable animals, particularly males, and that's it. So, yeah, they may still have that imprint. That's fine. But if they're living wild, then they should be considered not under some form of domestication anymore, because they're not.
Right, I agree. So what Beth is saying is that they are native because they evolved here, correct? And so, and I think that that's where the argument comes in, like you said. They did evolve here. They did die out at some point, but the species continued, just not here. This is what we talked about today in a snapshot. Um, so that's where the argument comes in, because they did die out at some point. That's where the bigger picture is saying, well, then they're not native, correct? I guess she's just
So
asking for
let me
clarification.
clarify one thing, because I want it well understood. I'm in a minority among biologists by claiming that Equus caballus was the species in North America. In the absence of any genetic evidence, what am I really talking about? What I'm talking about is the following: that any natural species consists of a whole lot of populations. That's the way life is organized. And when you've got mammals like the ones we're talking about, whose distribution is essentially worldwide now, thanks to human intervention, but even if you go back, right, it was all through Eurasia, eventually Africa and North and South America, by completely natural means. So those populations did diverge over time because the breeding pools were different. It's as simple as that. So what my colleagues in many cases would like to claim, that there's a certain number of minute differences, which I acknowledge, between Equus caballus as we know it today and some of these, certainly not all of these, but some of these Pleistocene horses. They would like to give different species names to anything that is significantly different from their point of view. My retort to that is called the biological species concept, which is very simple. If you can produce fertile, viable offspring that are capable of doing the same thing with their progeny, then that's a species, because that's what species is all about. It's not about anything else. It's about continuation of your type through time. And I am convinced that if we had a time machine and we were able to bring back a Pleistocene horse, we could mate that with the opposite sex of a living domestic horse, and they would produce viable, fertile offspring. However, we can't do that. So that's an empty argument. It's hypothetical, but it's nevertheless one I believe. And I'm just shocked by the idea that people would deny that kind of heritage and that kind of interpretation to the horses that we have running free, not under domestication in this country right now. To go back to bison, you know why the bison is the national mammal? It's because we felt so bad about almost extinguishing it. So we're not quite as blameworthy when it comes to horses. But now bison, which are just cows from my point of view, shaggy cows, are the national mammal, and they got all of this fine treatment. And horses, which were much more important to us at one time, get nothing at all.
Right. Beth asked again, in one of your articles, did you say that bison did not actually evolve here?
That is correct. Yeah, this is why it's such a joke from a biogeographical point of view. Everybody is from somewhere else.
Right.
They got here, they managed to adapt, and if they were lucky, they've survived up to the present. So in a nutshell, here's the bison story. Bison originated in Eurasia. They managed to get across the land bridge not very long ago from a paleontological perspective, somewhere between 180,000 years ago and 60,000 years ago. And that's like yesterday. So they have not been on our landscape for very long. Now, that may seem remarkable to you because the herd size back in the 19th century was supposed to be 60 million animals. So how did that happen if they came so recently? It happened because they were very good invaders. They found niche space that nobody else was occupying, and they made out like gangbusters, just like all the rest of us have done in our evolutionary history. So there's nothing special about bison, except they got lucky. They ended up in the New World and did extremely well until we showed up. And then
Right.
there was a problem.
And then Julie asked what is the historical significance of the horse in TRMP since it was a ranch?
Well, again, I'm no authority on this, but here's what's obvious to me. Teddy grew up at a time when the internal combustion engine was just being developed and was not even in production until close to the end of the 19th century. So he would have had horses. Of course he did. There's pictures of him. So he was a horse person. And at Elkhorn Ranch, he would have seen horses. So it makes no difference at all to me that if you want to purport that you want a park that is, in a sense, in his image, or it exemplifies some of the things he stood for, what he saw, what he did, then of course you want horses there. It couldn't have functioned as a ranch in the 1880s or thereabouts or earlier if they didn't have horses, because there was no other means of transportation. There was nothing.
Well, what they said in the last civic engagement meeting, the superintendent said that they're no longer interested in Theodore Roosevelt's ranching legacy. They're only interested in his conservation legacy.
Well, isn't that too bad? Because, people are interested in him as a personality. They would be interested in how he lived, what he did, what he saw. And the absurdity, this is why so many conservation advocates drive me crazy. They've got a laser-like view on what they consider proper.
Right.
So, native species deserve 100% protection under all circumstances, which I don't disagree with in principle, but you have to be realistic at the same time. And for a multi-purpose place like the Teddy Roosevelt, what you want are things that everybody can enjoy. So yeah, I don't know whether sage grouse is a big deal there or not, but apparently people are very concerned about sage grouse. So you make it possible that certain parts of the park are open to sage grouse and probably not much else. Fine, do that.
Right.
At the same time, understand that other people have other interests, and those interests could be served by exactly what we've been talking about today, where you've got a magnificent mega herbivore. There's not many mega herbivores left on the planet, I might add. They went down like gangbusters 10,000 years ago and other times. And the whole idea that you'd hold an animal like that in contempt really bothers me.
And I think too, it's also worth saying that I think they seem to miss the point. There would be no Theodore Roosevelt conservation legacy if there wasn't a ranching history. I mean, that's again, right?
No,
The absurdity.
it's people are incredibly narrow.
So thank you again. I truly appreciate it. It was great meeting you and talking to you. And I really appreciate your input and your insights, and thank you to everyone for being here. And we'll have this available on YouTube so other people can enjoy the information that you shared. I truly appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch, Chris, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you.